Although George Harrison grinned for the cameras, someone behind the scenes made it was a living horror for him. This Beatles bandmate dominated every note for years. George treated him like a servant, played with him, and made fun of his religious convictions. When George finally lost it in 1969, he left the studio. However, it wasn't the worst. This individual's actions during George's worst hours went beyond the boundaries of friendship. The treachery was so George's anger was so intense that it persisted till his last breath. We're revealing today George Harrison detested the startling truth about the Beatle more than anyone else. George Harrison was born in a modest cottage at 12 Arnold Grove, Liverpool, on February 25, 1943, the evening he was born. The city was bombed for the 78th consecutive night. His dad, Harold, worked 14-hour shifts as a bus conductor and only received $3 per week in order to save money on bus fare and walking miles. George and his brothers slept in the same bed. Up till the age of 16, Louise, his mother, earned money by cleaning offices at night. Just a few shillings for each building. They only had 15 shillings for meals for the entire week. However, Louise made their tiny house cozy and hopeful. At the age of 12 in 1955, George was riding his bike past a residence when he heard Heartbreak Hotel by Elvis Presley playing. Through a window that is open, he paused and froze, listening to the whole song. Everything changed in that instant. Elvis's voice, particularly the reverberation on the instrument, stoked George's passion. He informed his mother that he needed a more than food, guitar. Music became his life after that. George was 14 years old, acquired his first guitar at last. He made his way to Frank Hess's music store on foot to spend $3.20 on an inexpensive Eggman flat top. Playing was painful. In he practiced 6 to 8 hours a day, even though his fingertips bled for weeks. He became knowledgeable about rock Island Line first and quickly lost all interest in education. He failed practically all subjects, with the exception of art. Even his teacher wrote that George was concerned less about geometry and more about guitars. George met Paul McCartney in the same year. Paul saw George's guitar while they were traveling to Liverpool on the number 86 bus. According to George, he could play 20. It was not a simple undertaking. Flight rock. Paul was impressed. Not long after, George tried out for the Quarrymen, Paul's band. He performed Ranier flawlessly. Even he was only 14 years and 364 days old. Nevertheless, John Lennon refused to include someone so young. But there was no denying George's talent. He was the youngest participant in what would eventually be the most well-known band in history. George received assistance from the Harrison family in ways that most people wouldn't think possible. To assist pay for his musical demands, Louise took a third job cleaning the Cavern Club. Harold allowed George to ride the transportation for free, despite the fact that doing so might have cost him his job. When George required, they sold their piano for a better guitar. The band's first paid performance was in order to rent an amplifier. Louise even pawned her wedding band. George's dream benefited from every penny. One pivotal event occurred when Paul McCartney was unable to play his solo because he froze during a concert. The group came to the realization that required a suitable lead guitarist. Paul made a lot of effort to get George, but Lennon wasn't certain George was a child. Paul eventually wore him down. They organized a second audition outside Wilson Hall on a double-decker bus. George reprised his role as Ronchi, and Lennon ultimately came to an agreement. Subsequent investigation revealed that George had joined by December, even earlier than most people believed, was the 7th of 1957. From the start, Lennon viewed George less as an equal and more as a younger brother. Back then, the 3-year age difference was significant. George felt that he wasn't being taken seriously and that his opinions were frequently disregarded. With time, that tension only expanded. George blew up at the Let It Be sessions in 1969. He informed Lennon that he was dissatisfied and temporarily departed the band. Lennon even discussed replacing him with Eric Clapton. George subsequently claimed that he felt excluded, particularly after Lennon's life was touched by Yoko Ono. When George became a member of the band was already disintegrating. Quarrymen, the majority of the original members departed. Shortly after, their names were always changing. Long Joppage 3 and Johnny and the Moondogs. Prior to joining the Beatles in 1960, John was a member of the Silver Beatles. Their sound also changed. With George's presence, skiffle gave way to actual rock and roll. Paul and he added the ensemble got its first electric edge when they purchased an El Pico amp and added pickups to their guitars. George's technical abilities influenced the Beatles' early sound. Next was Hamburg, a cruel trial of survival. They were scheduled for the Kaiser Keller in 1960. They spent 8 hours playing songs for as long as they can in order to pass the time. The club, the owner insisted that they behave like untamed animals. George was only 17. There, the living area behind the stage was dirty and used by other bands. They hardly got any sleep. A former boxer who had killed someone in a street brawl was the club bouncer. Although difficult, it made they are experts. In 1962, George performed at the Star Club, learning what it meant to be a musician and performing every night in front of large audiences. The 9th of February, 1964, a memorable event occurred on American television. 73 million viewers watched the On the Ed Sullivan Show. The Beatles performed. More than 60% of all TVs were turned on. That night, in the country, 50,000 ticket requests had been sent to CBS. Even if there were only 728 seats in the studio. In 1957, Elvis Presley made his first appearance. Generated 7,000 requests. Ed Sullivan had his greatest performance that evening. Ratings with a 60 share and a 45.3 rating for the last 7 years. Even Richard, the audience included Julie and Tricia, Nixon's kids. The Beatles performed 5 songs. She Loves You, Till There Was You, and All My Loving. I Caught Sight of Her. I Want to Grasp Your Hand As I Stand There. Each of their names was sung. Showed up on the screen. The sentence that appeared when John Lennon appeared was, "Sorry girls, he's married." That moment was more than just amusement. Beatlemania was triggered by it. Across the United States and initiated the British invasion. It altered popular culture forever. Months prior to that momentous occasion, George Harrison was on the verge of creating his debut song. August was the month. 1963. He was confined to the Palace Court Hotel in Bournemouth due to a medical condition. The doctor gave him a tonic and advised him to relax. Harrison, who had nothing to do and was bored, grabbed a tape recorder and started playing around. Later on, he said that it was only to test his songwriting skills that endeavor turned into Don't Annoy Me. In one tape that has survived, he can be heard repairing the bridge, and the words weren't ready yet. So they were whistling the music. Bill Harry, a journalist from Liverpool, claimed he had shoved Harrison to compose a piece. In response, Harrison yelled, "Don't bother me." The song's title was derived from that statement. Harrison claimed years later that the song wasn't excellent and might not even qualify as a song. Yet it demonstrated something significant. It proved to him that he could write and that all he had to do was keep trying. Later that year, the song was featured with the Beatles, and it was the first time George had written a song for it. The Beatles album, Harrison, however, struck a wall even after that, as John Lennon George was frequently restricted to just 2 songs per album, whereas Paul McCartney wrote nearly all of the songs. Document. This regulation remained in effect. Starting in 1965, it led to stress that increased. For years, Paul acknowledged the existence of an unwritten rule in 2022. He and they were going to write the songs. John had agreed early on. We never suggested, let's keep. However, it was indicated. George struggled to persuade the band to even put his tunes on tape. Lennon, McCartney, and George Martin, their producer, didn't appreciate his work to the fullest extent until the Beatles' final years. Paul didn't say, until 1969, this year, his songs are at least not as wonderful as ours. Media coverage also didn't help. Every Beatles member received a label. George was the reserved one, Paul was the adorable one, and Lennon was the intelligent one. In the eyes of the public, Ringo was the fortunate one. From 1964 until 1970, every 6 weeks, the Beatles single was the best-selling one in America. And 1 out of every 3 weeks, the best-selling album. They were the first pop group to produce an entire album of original songs since Buddy Holly, When a Hard Wind Day's Night was released in July 1964. The majority of the attention was focused on John and Paul. Their relationship was what people were talking about, and their names were in every headline. Discussed, although George's contribution greatly influenced the band's sound, frequently ignored. Around 1965, the strain and constraints started to wear on him. He began dabbling with Indian music in the same year and also used LSD for the first time. The Beatles met Swami, Vishnu, Devananda in March and were presented with a copy of the entire Yoga Illustrated book. Later that Harrison discovered yoga while visiting Elvis Presley in the summer, but he wasn't too interested at first. But by the end of 1966, he was reading. He wasn't merely interested. He took Vivekananda and Yogananda more seriously, was searching for something more profound. He and John spent hours in the summer of 1967 on LSD in Greece, reciting the Hare Krishna mantra. By August, all 4, after seeing Maharishi Yogi, the Beatles made their no journey to Rishish in 1968. These weren't merely spiritual pastimes for George, they were a means of coping with the strain and discover tranquility. When he felt unnoticed in the band in April in 1965, Harrison experienced a scene at Twickenham Studios while filming Help that altered everything. Indian musicians played in the background during one scene as everyone waited. Curious, George took up a sitar between takes, believing the sound was odd, but it left a lasting impression on him. At about the same time, Indian-style tunes were being released by bands such as the Kinks and the Yardbirds. George went further. Though, as the rest of the band was getting stoned while filming, George's attention was diverted, and he was discovering a sound that the sitar would become his signature instrument, just as other guitarists had. A year later, Harrison first met Ravi Shankar in Ayana Deva Angadi's house in June 1966. But it wasn't merely after a cordial encounter. George and Ravi both cleared their schedules to tour throughout India in 3 months. Students typically had to wait years to learn from Shankar, but they spent 6 weeks together. However, Shankar claimed that George begged him to educate him practically immediately. Inquiries all the time and appeared to be very interested in Indian religion and music. Initially, Ravi believed it sounded weird, the sitar part on Norwegian would, but he knew George wasn't merely having fun. Their bond seemed predestined. On October 12, 1965, the sitar portion that George recorded for Norwegian Wood was the first time he had purchased the first Indian instrument ever featured in a Western pop song. It originated in a music store in Kolkata and was sold on Oxford Street in London. Finding the correct chords that fit the tune happened quickly, according to George, and that was it. Rock music's course was altered by that little incident. Song sparked a wave of sitar playing and the brief raga rock craze used in popular music. Years later, the identical sitar brought $62,500 at auction. During his honeymoon, George gave it away, and the bidding had begun at $50,000. In Barbados, to Patty Boyd, his wife's friend, although not all of the band, was ecstatic by his developing passion for Indian music. The Beatles went on tour in 1968. Harrison wanted to focus and meditate, so he traveled to India to learn with the Maharishi. Paul, on the other hand, continued to write songs for the White Album, which resulted in a major conflict. Later, Paul stated, "George actually once became very irritated and reprimanded me." George retorted, "Because I was trying to think of the next album. Where we're here to meditate, not to record the next album." That moment demonstrated the stark contrast between them. Paul preferred to labor continuously, whereas George waited for inspiration. Paul believed that George's emphasis on religion could be dangerous or even a bit ridiculous. George Harrison was usually referred to as the silent Beatle, but George believed Paul was unaware of what was truly important. A storm that had been building for years was hidden beneath that serene image. In 1966, George got his chance at last. He penned not 1, but 3 songs for the Revolver album. Tunes, including Love You Too and I Want to Tell You, and Taxman opened the entire record. Followed. This was significant since, up until that point, he had hardly been permitted to contribute, but the others pushed him back as soon as he moved forward. When they started working on later that year, George introduced a song called Only a Northern to Sgt. Pepper's song. It was critical of the band's handling of songwriting credits and finances. Lennon and McCartney didn't only they made sure he only had 1 song on the record, therefore they rejected it. Paul subsequently stated George simply showed little interest, but that was not the case. He was excluded, and he subsequently called the entire he ended up recording Inside of You Without You alone, which made the album experience dull. He was, literally, the only Beatles member in the studio that day when Indian musicians arrived in to assist, but not Paul, John, or Ringo. Even after the song was over, the others didn't bother to turn up even after George Martin added strings. For the first time, the rest of the Beatles did not contribute to the creation of the song. Lennon subsequently claimed that it was among George's greatest tunes, although he hadn't given a damn at the time. Reason to go. But Paul's demeanor made matters worse by publicly mocking George's fascination with Indian spirituality and music. George was delving deeply into Hinduism. Paul would crack, roll his eyes, and read Vedic books while learning to play the sitar. Jokes, and get out of the room while George was having sessions. George felt made fun of. It was more than just music, and it stung a lot when he mentioned that they didn't even try to understand what he was offering. They regarded it as a joke, and it was spiritual. Now, everyone stated, although it was never the case, the Beatles operated like a democracy. Lennon and George only received 1 or 2 songs per album, and McCartney had complete control, while they filled the remainder. George didn't even own his songs, and even his better ones were ignored. Publications as they did, he received less money, recognition, and attention. He wasn't treated equally, and Dylan was right when he reportedly remarked, George had to fight to get anything on the records. By 1967, George had a ton of tunes and was considered like an assistant. All Things Must Pass was one of those songs that many wouldn't even listen to. Brought it to the Let It Be sessions, where McCartney and Lennon dismissed it with a laugh and claimed it didn't suit. Was tense. At one point, George even handed the song to Billy Preston, simply to escape them. It became a classic when he published it himself 3 years later, along with My Sweet Lord. And isn't it unfortunate that they tried more than 100 times to avoid being found guilty? Several times before he gave up, and those songs showed that he had been correct all along.